Good day, everyone. I'm Wendy Erickson, and I'm here with my colleague, Megan Hales. And we are thrilled to welcome you to our event today, Adapting Bold Ideas from Startup Colleges and Universities. Today, we have the privilege of hosting two distinguished authors, Bryan Penprase and Noah Pickus, who will share invaluable insights from their new book, The New Global Universities. We think this is a prime opportunity to hear from them, as well as 6 of our higher ed advisors, who will be asking questions that tie the findings from Bryan and Noah's research back to their colleges and universities, and hopefully all of yours, and how entrepreneurism, change management, and collaboration are key to our work in adapting to the new world of education. Just a brief intro on adjacent markets and expert atlas. We really believe that co-creation and co-collaboration between education professionals and the technology leaders and companies working to solve these challenges is necessary to really progress faster, as well as lead to better outcomes. So the work that we're doing is really pulling these audiences together and looking for ways to create more opportunities for collaboration. And this is one of them. So before I hand it over to Bryan and Noah, the format of the event today will be a short intro from them around their insights and some of their findings from 8 global startup universities. We won't be able to cover all of them, obviously, but they'll give us some insights and highlights. And then we'll have 6 of our higher ed advisors and as experts ask questions. So the idea is to go into breakout rooms to do a little bit of a deeper dive. We'll see how timing goes and if that's possible. And in the meantime, please feel free to put your questions in the chat, and we will do our best to answer them today, or as a follow-up via email and video. So without further ado, I am delighted to hand you over to our esteemed authors, Bryan and Noah. Take it over.
Great, thanks, Wendy. I'll start briefly and then hand it over to Bryan. I'm just going to give you 3 quick slides. Since most of you have not read the book, to orient us. First, how did we get into this book? What's the background? And it's the background all of you know, which is there are a lot of pressures on higher education about quality, about value, about cost and access, about demographic change and technology change. And yet the institutional systems for change within higher education, as Bryan's colleague, Bryan Rosenberg here says, are often on universities, whatever it is, I'm against it. And so it's hard to bring about change within traditional higher ed institutions. Bryan and I met more than 10 years ago when we were both on a fellowship. Bryan had come from Pomona College. I was at Duke. And we both got involved in building. Bryan helped build Yale NUS in Singapore. I helped build Duke Kunshan University in China. And we were astonished to discover that the gloom and doom in the US context was not shared worldwide, and that there were any number of innovative, entrepreneurial, new institutions, often grounded in a liberal arts and science ethos, although taking different forms. And we found that the sun was shining all around the world in just about every continent. Some of these universities were more mobile and networked than traditional institutions. Some of them emphasized far more coherent curriculum and experiential learning integrated in a way far beyond what we had seen at our institutions. Some of these universities were addressing the question of cost, sometimes within their regional context and sometimes globally. And the thing I think we found most fascinating about them was that sometimes you have on campuses a small shop that is supposed to innovate. These were entire campuses that were set out to be incubators from the beginning. And these are the people who started these universities or are currently sustaining them. And essentially what the book does is it just tells their stories and the stories of these 8 universities around the world, on the presumption that we have a lot of stories about business entrepreneurs and innovators, but not so many about in higher ed. And these are all academic entrepreneurs, although many of them came from outside traditional academia. Some came from deep within it. And the basic message I think we would want to share about the book here is we're academics. Of course, we have critical things to say about aspects of what they did, but the book is mostly intended to be rather inspirational. It's not a handbook to, here's a checklist of the 10 things to do if you're trying to change your campus in Chicago. But we do think that it's time to tell some stories about founders and entrepreneurs in academia who've built really solid institutions that often have inspiring stories to tell about the difficulties they overcame to do that. Bryan, I'll hand it over to you from there.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks, Noah. And yeah, it's been a real joy to get to know these people who are bold, daring entrepreneurs in their own right. And yet they've sort of tempered their approach to entrepreneurship by the realities of academia. And this is one of the key messages of the book, is that higher ed is indeed ready for change, disruption, whatever you want to call it. But there are forces, both necessary and both unnecessary, that prevent this from changing at the speed which many want it to. And so when we go into these situations, we all think we have the answer and very quickly run into multiple layers of complexities that are beyond daunting. We call it in the book six-dimensional chess, because you simultaneously have to navigate between diametrically opposed stakeholders in the form of students, parents, employers, governments, accreditors, faculty, and all of these people are tugging in different directions. And so it takes a master communicator and an incredible leader to be able to navigate between these tensions and find some solutions that are equitable and that integrate the ideas of the founding team. So in the same way that a startup company has this imperative to kind of move quickly and to, in some parlance, move fast and break things, academia has a similar imperative, especially for a startup, to move fast, but we can't really break things. In the world of academia, we've got students in our trust. And so there has to be a little more care and a little more thoughtful approach. And all of these entrepreneurs, when they come into this situation, very quickly learn the need to adjust for these approaches and to really sort of integrate the diversity of their team and the various cultural cross currents that are always at play in academia into their work. So those are really fascinating parts of the story, as well as how these entrepreneurs walked into these situations and then very quickly learned, adapt, pivoted, if you will, to the realities of the moment, and then rose up to that challenge and really triumphed in really inspiring ways. So ultimately, this book is kind of a note of hope, too, in what is otherwise a very gloomy literature for higher ed. And so we really see it as an antidote to the feeling of helplessness and hopelessness that pervades so much of our academia. These are 8 success stories, even the one that is not fully running right now. It's being absorbed by NUS. By all accounts, has been a real success in terms of launching students into amazing careers, fellowships, entrepreneurial roles, et cetera. So that's just kind of the quick summary for you guys. And then I guess we're going to dive into the question period next. So yes, I'm handing it back to whoever is next. Wendy.
Fantastic. Megan's going to is going to introduce the first speaker.
All righty. The first question or first speaker today is Dawn. Would you like to introduce yourself and then roll into your question?
Hi, sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Dawn Bunja. I'm the owner and principal education consultant for Arcadia. I've been in higher ed for 25 years, doing lots of program design, curriculum design, and university launches on every habitable continent, as I told our other panelists today. And I'm very excited about asking my question. I'm coming from a background of curriculum design, if you want to keep that in mind. So Noah and Bryan, existing universities have ongoing relationships with regulators and professional accreditation bodies. New universities have to start those relationships from scratch. And same with the designs. They typically have very highly talented, disciplined faculty, but little or no experience or background in instructional design or curriculum design. Modern competitive curriculum design has to consider not just the academic content, which they're great at, but also student employability, the competitive landscape with other institutions globally, and finding the right audience. So they have to have that, unicorn status of business and academics in mind. What would you say was the most common challenge that the universities you dealt with faced related to curriculum design, and how successful were they in overcoming it?
Wow. Maybe, no, if I just jump and you can add to the main idea that we felt when we were helping build the Yale and US College in Singapore was that we were kind of building a railroad as we were laying track in front of us, or the common metaphor is building an airplane while flying. And the faculty, while they may have great ideas, they really usually aren't trained in this area. So in many cases, we had to make it up as we went along or consult quickly with experts. And I think in all of the cases that we saw, there was definitely an improvisational nature to it. In some cases, there was a space and time sort of laid out for that improvisation. So some of the schools took a full year for either an incubation year, as was the case for Yale and US, or the partner year, as was the case for Olin College. And those year-long spaces gave them time to kind of refine, test, think about, and evaluate the little components of their curriculum. And maybe most importantly, to test it out with students. And there's kind of a joke that we had in Singapore that basically no curriculum survives contact with the students, that once you actually get it in front of the students, there are all these realities that you didn't expect. So I think, one of the lessons that we learned is that all of these schools were very resource strapped, very short-handed, and yet incredibly energetic and producing massive amounts of curriculum, great ideas sort of springing out from all directions. But we were hoping to maybe have the book as also something of a map for future startup environments, so that they'll just be able to anticipate this crush of pressure, and also the necessity to have some level of field testing and a cycle for that built into the process. And in these cases, that was done, but often improvisationally. There are some exceptions. And Noah, can you maybe jump in and give more nuance to that?
Well, I would just add briefly that a lot of what we ran into was that the upfront constraints are all external. They're basically accreditation and their prestige, because prestige is such a driver in higher ed. And those require strategies to overcome them. And we could talk more about that if you'd like. But perhaps to your point, Dawn, the real challenges often were internal, the real constraints. And the constraints are, even in a new environment, let alone in an established one, that the faculty are drawn to the familiarity bridge. Even if you tell them you get to do something new, they often they're bound, they live inside their laptops. And so they're connected to a community, and it's a disciplinary community. And I think in terms of things like instructional design, I think the main point I would stress there is that faculty can learn to benefit from curriculum and instructional design, but they will always see you in a service position to them, as opposed to an intellectually leadership position, which is what we've observed in these schools. You have to harness faculty, and you can't harness them if you're always in the, let me just show you one way this could be easier. You have to be an intellectual leader with them, which is of course challenging, but we found it to be necessary in the schools we looked at.
I agree 100%, Noah. Thank you for that. Thank you, Bryan.
Bryan, Noah, thanks for joining us today. Appreciate it. I'm Joe Testani. I'm the Deputy of the President of the University of Rochester. My career was really in career education and career preparation for undergraduate and graduate students. I'm currently working on the university's strategic plan, charting our future and what comes next for the next 5 to 7 years of the University of Rochester. So my question really kind of revolves around career preparation, career education, skill development. And I'm curious how that ties into Dawn's question a little bit around instructional design and curriculum design. Obviously in higher ed right now, the value of education is being called into question yet again, especially the liberal arts education. So I'm curious as to maybe some of the takeaways or themes when you're looking at the institutions in your book, how they address this issue of career preparation and skill development. How did it map to their curriculum? What were their conversations like in other countries around career education and skill development, and how you saw that integrating into these startups?
Yeah. Bryan, let me just make a link to the last comment here and then hand it to you. I think the link is this, Joe, and it's the intellectual link that I want to make here, which is in a number of the schools that we saw, I'll pick two, African Leadership University and Minerva University. They managed to combine intellectual leadership of what would be a coherent curriculum that would have real impact with the skills and habits and workforce development aspect by not treating them as separate. They began by doing an analysis. They did it in different ways. They consulted with different kinds of stakeholders, but they both identified, African Leadership University started out, I think, with 135 skills. They put them into 8 categories. Minerva had, I don't know how many, they're down to 80 now, and they change over time. But the core thing they said was that it's not enough to talk about the content of what you're doing and what books you read, which is what faculty do. You have to actually work together as faculty to understand what are the core habits and skills that are transferable, that are durable, that last, not too narrow, how to do Excel, right? But not too abstract, understand the history of Western civilization. That is an intellectual challenge faculty can really get involved in, and it bridges to the workforce aspect without giving in to a too just-in-time aspect of it. And that's what we saw a lot. And ALU focused this not only on skills, but I use the word habits. Their slogan is do hard things, because their view was they're building leaders across Africa, and it's a cultural capacity that they're building as well as a technical skill. Bryan?
Yeah, and that's really a good point, Noah. And another aspect of it that we found fascinating was when we think of these 21st century skills, or whatever you want to call them, fourth industrial revolution, all the stuff we hear in VUCA type stuff, everyone's looking at and the ability to navigate across domains. And so this was part of the design requirement of the schools that we looked at. They were less about technical proficiency and more about these very high level cognitive skills that were agile across cultures and domains. And it was really interesting to see how in each instance, they found different solutions to what in many ways was the same problem. In some cases, the solutions were translating what you might think of as a liberal arts model to different cultural and regional contexts. So in the case of Ashesi University, trying to take the best of Swarthmore, but bring it down to the realities that are in the developing country like Ghana, and really focusing on the imperative to have ethics and leadership at the core of it, and to dispense with all the extraneous trappings that would increase costs and distract the students from the core mission of the institution, which was to create ethical entrepreneurial leaders. And so in this way, you kind of are retooling liberal arts in a little bit more lean and a little more purpose-driven form, also true to the culture and sensibilities of the African continent. And it was just fascinating to see liberal arts reinterpreted in these ways. It's not to say that there wasn't attention to skills. And in particular, Ashesi University now has a partnership with ETH in Switzerland for what's called mechatronics, where they can send students off for advanced degrees. But I think there's very much an awareness that the core foundation that all these schools were after was this kind of cognitive agility that allows them to be able to really communicate in new ways and to really create in new ways, which a lot of the countries in the world are rediscovering or discovering the power of that kind of liberal arts type model of education. And that was another paradox too of the book, is that many people in the US are sort of being dissuaded from liberal arts or disenchanted with it. But across Asia, it's just a rage. People recognize its power for unleashing creativity and entrepreneurship.
Thank you both for that answer. I feel like we could dig into that topic for a long time in and of itself. We have 25% international students at our institution, and I think we're seeing those students choosing liberal arts degrees, or at least coupling it with their more technical degrees, if you will. So we're seeing that start to play out with our high school students coming into the university. So thank you both for that deep dive on that topic.
Okay, thank you, Noah and Bryan. I think your book is timely, and I agree with you. There's great excitement outside the US in terms of, the role of higher education as population expands, especially on the African continent. And I come to this with about 20 years of experience in international education, most of it as an implementer from UCLA, working with higher ed institutions, building up their capacity, some of it on the policy level internationally. So I'm going to put on my policy hat for right now and ask a more macro question, as well as ask you about your predictions of the future. So what approaches do these global universities, and I think, Bryan, this jumps off from what you were saying, take to address local considerations? Because access, affordability, and accreditation are very important. And in what way, this is the prediction I want to ask, in what way do you think these early decisions impact the sustainability of these institutions? And I'm thinking that, this feels very much, not that I was around, but post-colonial time, when higher education was entering, Latin America, Africa, and Asia, and there was all this excitement. And somewhere along the line, we kind of lost our way. How do we prevent that from these stories?
Well, I mean, one of the things we were talking about yesterday, we had a brief huddle before this, was the ways in which the local cultures are kind of refracted and amplified through these colleges. So first of all, in terms of sort of shedding off more colonial models of education and really kind of taking a different ground, and you might say a higher ground, in terms of really developing students' potentialities in an open-ended way, these schools are really, really setting a new standard for higher education in a lot of the countries that they're in. And yet, as you mentioned, there's a question about access and sustainability and affordability. And in some cases, these schools had to invent financial aid. There's a really interesting story about how Fulbright Vietnam had to actually invent financial aid in order to provide scholarships for lower income students. In a similar way, Ashesi and Ashoka have financial aid. ALU, on the other hand, really tried to push the cost as low as possible, aiming for as low as a $3,000 a year price point. So they all pushed as hard as they could to bring the costs down as low as they could. But they also, in the end of the day, recognized that there's a need for just a very intensive, labor intensive, very high touch, very interactive kind of education. And that stubbornly resists scaling. And so at the best that these schools are able to do was to provide financial aid to get socioeconomic diversity in their classes. And they've done a really good job of it, as well as their resources can allow.
Let me just add two quick things to that. One is, in terms of predictions, Bryan and I take the view in this book, we call ourselves pluralists, by which we mean that, for the last 10 or so years, there's been an enormous focus in higher education, as there should be, on questions of access and affordability, which is often brought about by then saying, well, the answer must be scale. You must scale, right? We've talked before, Stacy's at ASU. I've spent a lot of time working with ASU, have a lot of admiration for it. Our work on this book was a little bit different, where we thought there can be too much emphasis on one big institution or four big institutions getting bigger, and that an equally important approach is to have a pluralistic ecology in which you have experiment and innovation going on that fits better with the local context, as you say, but also needs to be linked, that micro has to be linked to a meso level ecology and network of innovators. So it's not just 400 places reinventing the wheel, but neither does it have to be, if we don't go to scale, right? Whenever you go to ASU GSV, and if the question is, well, does it scale? And that's an important question, but it is not the only question, especially because scale can often be at odds with local context and sometimes with quality. And so we're trying to advance a pluralistic, not antagonistic to the ASUs, because again, we find a lot of value there, but to broaden the conversation a little bit from where we think it has been perhaps a little bit narrowly rooted.
At one point, Noah and I were in book conversations. We had a wonderful set of writing retreats. And the analogy of the university as kind of a vehicle of sorts. It can be a small boat, it can be an ocean liner, it can be a small airplane, a fighter jet. And so we really sort of see different design requirements for different scope of university, different scale of university. And in this case, all of these schools had a very high requirement for intense residential interactive communities as part of the sort of design. And that's partly why we chose the sample as well, because we're really interested in seeing all the nuances and cultural effects that happen in these very tight-knit communities.
Thank you both. We could stay forever, but I'm going to cede ground here.
Hi, my name is Chris Wenger. I'm currently the Director of Technology Training and ERP Project Manager at Colorado Mountain College, which is a dual mission community college that offers four-year degrees. And for the past 20 years or so, I've had roles in both academic affairs and IT with a focus on creating engaging student experiences through innovative technology, course design, and high-impact practices. So looking at your book through the community college lens, my question is, these community colleges, they do share some of the qualities that you discuss with these new global universities, in particular, smaller size, a focus on affordability. But for community colleges, in large part, they exist to serve their local communities, which you've touched on a little bit, and in particular, workforce needs. And they often have considerable budget constraints. So how do you envision, or how do they fully capture and express that entrepreneurial innovation you characterize so well in your book?
Okay,
Sure.
well, so I'm not sure if your question is about community colleges, how they capture.
Yeah.
So certainly you have an incredible level of resourcefulness and invention going on in community colleges. In many cases, necessity is the mother of invention, and there's so many demands on those institutions that they've been incredibly inventive. And we see the same in these schools that are operating in developing countries where the resources just aren't there to build a full-on kind of high cost type Swarthmore environment. I guess what I would say is that in many ways the community colleges are kindred spirits to these startup institutions, because they are in such a resource constrained environment and because they are so inventive. And another key factor that they share with these institutions is that they're squarely focused on the students. And we found in all of our schools a very refreshing shift of the focus away from faculty scholarship as the main driver toward a full-hearted and 100% focus on the needs of students in these schools. And that was a refreshing shift. Now, there's a spectrum, of course, in our group. A couple actually do have quite high levels of research going on, but 6 out of 8 of them were just quite honest about the need to focus on students and teaching above the research mission. And that saved a lot of money, and that really sort of enabled the mission of the university to also be less kind of multifaceted and more streamlined. So in that sense, they do share a lot with the community colleges. What do you think? Noah,
Well, I think, yeah, Chris, this is a question that quite rightly stretches us because we weren't looking at community college type schools, despite the parallels that you and Bryan have drawn. So I want to acknowledge that right up front. I have just 2 thoughts, one very practical and one rather moralistic maybe. The practical one is probably something you're already doing. But what we saw at some schools, particularly the less well-resourced, is that the whole model that they built was a model of how you learn how to learn and how you learn from others. Now, those are standard things, right? We all say that in higher education. But what that meant was sourcing an online course and having the students figure out how to do it. This is what unlocked ALU's model, where they could not find enough instructors that they needed at the right level where they were in Africa. And then they discovered that they were sourcing some of the best courses in the world that were online, and that the students were having to teach themselves how to do this. And it was partly that they gained the knowledge, right? Here's intro to AI, or here's a coding course. But it was largely that actually the students were learning how to teach themselves how to do it. And that itself was the skill. And that goes to the second broader point, which is I noted when you said that community colleges serve the local economy, which of course is true in all kinds of ways. It's in your mission, it's in your stakeholders. But the question is, what does it mean to serve that economy? And to the degree to which it's producing very specific trained people in certain skills that will go out of fashion or out of need quickly, then you're not actually serving the students or the local community as well. And it goes back to these things we were talking about with Joe and Dawn about to what degree do you have two curriculums, a curriculum of the technical content and a curriculum of the habits and skills and a taxonomy that you're teaching, where students therefore have an ability to reach beyond what you just were teaching them in that instance. So I apologize if these are things that you already do and say in Colorado, but those are first thoughts.
No, that's very much appreciated. We all need to learn how to be better for our students. So thank you.
I think I'm next. Hi, I'm Stacy Freeman. I'm the Dean of Students at ASU California Center in Los Angeles. We're a new expansion campus, and that's why I came back to ASU now for the third time. It's already kind of been mentioned, but ASU is very entrepreneurial and we very much build the plane as we're flying it. And I think that's a really exciting place to be and why I've come back. I've been in higher ed almost 20 years. And again, this is my third stint at ASU, very much for that reason. I think it very much mirrors a lot of the things you've already been talking about, but I'm curious for more of those traditional universities who maybe do struggle to move and create change in any kind of timely way. I'm wondering from your research if you have any maybe high level things that you think other universities could implement in order to create some change, some movement.
Bryan, did you want to start? I think you're on mute.
Yeah, just very quick, and I'll let Noah wrap it up. The main thing that all of these schools have when they start is this meeting where everything's out on the table. The entire curriculum, sometimes called as a blank page. And in those moments, all the assumptions are questioned of how higher education should be. Somehow, I think existing institutions have to create spaces where maybe not all of the assumptions are on the table, but more of them, and have a really deep and very honest and searching conversation about their purpose and about all the things that they've been doing for so long that they haven't really questioned. And maybe we're too polite in a lot of our higher education institutions to really allow for the kind of conversation that's needed. But I'd say that would be something that could be done at a lot of existing institutions, really have that sort of zero-base kind of reckoning of everything on the campus. Why is it there? And questioning everything. And then in that sense, reinventing from the ground up.
Yeah, let me add to that 2 points. One is, and I think this applies as much to ASU as it does to the smallest school that we studied, and that is that the leadership brought a distinct combination of two things that are almost opposites. One is they were just incredibly audacious. They just said things, they built missions, not just missions, they Fred Swaniker in African Leadership University didn't want to create universities. He wanted to create a new leadership cadre for Africa. And it turned out universities was the way he figured out he wanted to do that. And when there was conflict over would this be the Harvard of Africa or would it be the institution he thought it needed to be, he said, I don't care about the Harvard of Africa. I don't, right? And half the people got fired or left. He stuck to an audacious claim of what he thought it would take to build the leadership he believed in. Now, the other part, so that's the gas. And if you're at ASU, you know what I mean. The brakes, if you will, is flexibility. Is that in almost every case at the Olin College of Engineering, they have a famous moment where, as Bryan indicated, they overdid it. They just over-designed 1 million times in the first year, and the students were breaking down in tears. Imagine 400 engineers all breaking down in tears, right? It's not a pretty picture. And so they canceled classes and they brought out the bouncy houses. And they now call it the bouncy house moment, and they periodically have to do that. And so building in the ability to say, this is an audacious goal, but we have to be flexible about how we're getting there. And building in a culture of continuous improvement is the hardest thing that certainly Bryan and I have experienced. I suspect you all have experienced. And we saw at these schools because they're opposite. Some places don't have either, and then some have one or the other. And it was a challenge in many of our universities that we studied because sometimes the leader who's super audacious isn't so flexible, right? And yet must be flexible because, in fact, there's no way you can know it in advance. And I think that translates in practical terms to what Bryan was talking about, where the single thing that doesn't happen on most campuses that we see that was different in these startups is the student experience and the curriculum, right? And the work experience and all these things, they're just all designed separately. They are not actually linked coherently. And why should we imagine that a student is going to make connections amongst them if we didn't actually design it that way? And that's the thing that's most missing.
Yeah, and to what Noah's saying, the leadership is really remarkable, and this book is really a tale in many ways about leadership, and it's leadership in the interest of forming a vision and implementing a vision and assembling it into what becomes a coherent culture. But implicit in that also is the other side of the leadership, having a community that's willing to follow. And in this case, a lot of these people who sign up for a startup institution, faculty and students, they're all in for the adventure. They're all deeply committed to the idea. And this is something I think that's sorely lacking in a lot of existing universities, because both students and faculty can often be very instrumental and look out for their individual interests far above the collective interests of the institution. But in these cases, the schools, because they're brand new, because they're fragile, because they're being co-created by students and faculty in real time, there's this amazing sense of ownership, an amazing sense of common interest in these schools. And finding ways to reignite that sense of ownership and agency in faculty and students, I think, would be really exciting. And we're hoping that the lessons from these startups might sort of go part of the way to opening up the imagination to that kind of environment on existing campuses.
Thank you.
Sam Weber here. I think I'm last, but hopefully certainly not least in this scenario. But I head up innovation at Purdue Global. I've lapped the sun 16-ish years as a learning technologist. But as I was speaking with the authors and the panelists in the green room just before the call, I've only been in academia for about, give or take, 100, 120 days. I think my question specifically is, it feels like AI is outpacing traditional pedagogy. So at Purdue Global, we just launched our own AI generative online tutor in the classroom. I think the struggle we have is keeping pace with how students will learn in the future. So I want to ask the authors, what are your observations about what AI is doing, or what could it do in the higher ed classroom?
Well, I'm going to start this one, Noah, if that's okay, because my computer actually is malfunctioning because I have 4 or 5 AI processes running at once. So I had to jump onto my cell phone. I think we're all scrambling to figure out what it means. This is what I'm studying in my sabbatical this year. I'm out in Boston looking at Harvard, MIT, Northeastern, other schools, and how they're all grappling with the AI revolution. I think we're starting to see little green shoots, like what you're also doing in your institution. These tutoring systems are really starting to deliver results and really starting to live up to some of the hype. And we're seeing the possibility of a much more adaptable, much more efficient learning environment that allows students to progress at their own pace in really exciting ways. And it really pushes the learning into a whole different category where students all become coaches of the AI in some sense. They have to learn as they're learning themselves how to teach the AI how to learn. And it's a really different cognitive environment. And the faculty also have to figure out new ways to assess student learning. So I think that the happy idea behind all of this is that students can jump much more quickly into very high levels of functionality. And yet I think I do worry a little bit about how the emphasis on skills and sort of output, writing, programming, that sort of thing, might crowd out the much more important discussion of what does this all mean? What do we mean as humans? And what is our role in this world where AI may even know more than us? And in that sense, the skills that many of these schools are developing, the idea of citizenship, the idea of being part of a community, the idea of ethics, those take on an even higher premium. And maybe since students will learn some of these fundamental skills more quickly with the AI tutors, there'll be more space for dialogue and conversation about some of those other purely human topics. So I kind of see a great accelerator to a lot of the stuff that we might have taken 12 weeks out of a semester doing. And then all of those sort of meta skills, more time for those to be able to be developed in our schools with AI, sort of taking care of a lot of the heavy lifting of the basic skills.
I'll just layer on to that, Sam, that I think AI is doing something similar to what we saw during the pandemic online instruction is doing. And that is it's revealing how incredibly bad we are at educating. What parents saw during the pandemic was how bad, how bad their kids sit in a lecture by somebody just talking and talking. Learning science would tell you from the beginning, 20 minutes maximum. And even that is not a particularly active form of learning. And so I want to emphasize that AI will change things in so many ways, as Bryan indicated, that you and we are all grappling with. But I think what it's revealing is bringing us back to our core, which is, so what is a true underlying education? And this is no different than talking with Joe at Rochester, or Dawn in the curriculum question, or Chris at Colorado, which is, are we teaching content, right, which has useful but limited dimensions? Or are we teaching thinking? And everyone would say, oh, thinking. And then you'd say, well, what are you teaching? Oh, critical thinking. And they say, well, what do you mean by that? Well, thinking critically. The ability to understand what critical thinking or what creativity means, and how it's broken down, and how it's put back together, and how it can be transferred from one area to another. That's not AI. AI sits on top of that. And so from my perspective, the question is, are we doing that underlying work, or are we letting AI just come layered on top of really bad pedagogy and bad content-oriented curriculum?
Yeah, the last thing we want is for AI to just accelerate and amplify bad teaching, which was sort of the outcome of a lot of the online learning, at least in the early days of the MOOC revolution, which was sort of the earlier hype cycle of technology. And yet also in the online learning, after a while, as people started to question the enterprise of teaching by adapting it to this new format, there were a lot of really important insights about what good teaching was. And it really did spark a lot of conversation, especially at larger universities, about how to teach better. So I think in a similar way, the AI will do that same kind of catalytic effect, where people, as they begin to adapt to it, will also reconsider how they've thought about teaching and learning, and how they especially think about assessments, about the idea of just having students write papers, because that will happen automatically with the AI. But then it becomes instead a task of, well, how do I communicate in other ways? How do I assess multiple different points of view? How do I work with other people? And those skills, I think, will become much more prominent in future AI-dominated universities.
Interesting insight. Thank you so much. We're just starting development on the 1.1 version of the Purdue Global Learning Assistant, our AI tutor. So I will report back to the team.
Cool.
Okay, thanks everyone. That was a really great conversation, really incredible insights. We had talked about going into a breakout room. However, with 10 minutes left, and we've got some really good questions in the chat. So if everyone's okay with that, I'm going to open it up to questions. Do we have a thumbs up? Is everyone good with? Okay. Austin, I'm going to hand it over to you, which I think you had a really relevant question around enrollment and some of the challenges around that. So I'll take it over.
Hi, everyone. I'm Austin. I've been working in K-12 and higher education for a number of years. Did some research on liberal arts models. Bryan, we met like.
Yeah, I recognize you. Yeah, good to see you again.
I work at Avenues now as a global director for our extensions programs in the R&D department. So one thing we do when we're doing innovations is you can't innovate if you don't have any students, right? That's kind of a prerequisite. Not students. So I was curious to hear some of your reflections and kind of sharebacks of learnings from these new institutions of how they conducted admissions, both in terms of attracting students in general to get enrollment, but also finding the right fit of students, because they're all doing different things. And so I'd imagine the profiles they're looking for are pretty different.
Noah, do you want to start or?
Go ahead, you can start, Brian.
Okay, well, in our case, the enrollment pressures in what you might call the global South are kind of a mirror image of the US, right? There's a huge population of under 25s that in many countries are exceeding everyone else. So the unique demographic cliff that the US and many other developed countries have are certainly not in play in places across Africa, India, so forth. All the same, in communicating to students what you are, you have the challenge as a startup university and having students show up at a non-existent place that doesn't have accreditation for a degree that they don't understand its value. And so there, the imperative is really to communicate the unique value proposition of the institution. And thankfully, all of these schools had a very clear idea of how they were changing education, and the very high-end type of education that they were trying to offer was incredibly attractive to students. So many of these schools saw, very high selectivity in the very first years, somewhere in the range of 4% for some of the schools like Yale and US. And that's because they're really aiming for the top, but also because they're really communicating something different. And I think students really are, they're very critical shoppers for good reason. They don't want to waste their time and money. And I think a lot of these schools, by really, again, reconsidering higher education from the ground up, I think they were able to promise a different value proposition and actually deliver it. And you've seen the quality of these schools has been remarkable. So at this point, none of them have been suffering for enrollment pressure.
Yeah, in many of our schools, they responded to the fact that prestige drives so much of higher education by finding ways to invent it. Right? They would associate, whether it was who they put on the board, or by who they affiliated with, or by just their whole advertising approach was actually to say, yes, we don't have 400 years of history, but they wanted to establish themselves in some way as playing the prestige game, even if they sought to upend it, right? And you could see in one school, in Minerva University, their slogan, to Bryan's example here, was 4 years, 7 countries, right? We are going to have a completely distinctive kind of experience here. And then they designed an admission system which was very hard to game. They really thought through, how do you make sure that you're not simply privileging people who can know how to game a system in advance? And that has proven that, they admit students largely under $50,000 a year, many under $25,000 a year. And part of that was because they were not looking at standard metrics.
Yeah, we could run down the distinctiveness of each school, but it's important to point out too that there were just simple cost advantages that these schools had. In many cases, they were offering the same quality of higher education in their home country that was available in the US or Europe. So even though they were expensive by the standards of the local country, they would save students tens of thousands of dollars a year to be able to stay in the country, and would also have the additional benefit of keeping them in country after graduation at higher rates. So this is one of the beauties of these schools, is they provided not only different value proposition, but a really good cost point, really delivering a lot more value for the same amount of money.
Really interesting. Thank you.
And it looks like we have one additional question. Jenna, you are up.
Thank you. Thanks so much. And thank you for this great conversation. I'm Jenna Garchar. I currently work at Civitas Learning. I come from a study abroad background, having worked at Northeastern University and CIEE. I'm curious, at the schools that you looked at, if there was anything striking about how they were structured and if they were following that typical hierarchical model, or if you saw like the use of more project managers and more like how they were ensuring that interdisciplinary collaboration could actually happen structurally. Curious about that. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'll mention one thing, and Bryan can add to it. I think the single biggest trend we saw was no departments, or departments much more broadly construed. physical location where faculty were located, not according to discipline. So it doesn't speak to all the questions you're raising there. But the notion that as soon as you say we're going to have an interdisciplinary university that includes experiential education and yada, 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 and then you build the biology building and the history building, you basically are reinforcing everything that you're trying to get away from. And once you do that, structures, things flow from there. Bryan?
Yeah, I mean, that was part of the architecture, not the physical architecture, but the sort of organizational architecture. And having the luxury of building a place from the ground up means that you can dispense with warring departments. And almost every one of these institutions did that. And so that allows you to also reconceptualize the academic process more largely, in that the faculty are not segregated into different corners of the campus, are not competing for interest, but are paired or even brought together in teams to teach interdisciplinary subjects. And this is a dream that a lot of faculty and administrators have, because unfortunately departments can often balkanize institutions and set them into warring encampments. So thankfully these schools, given the chance to get rid of that sort of tension, they were able to organize people in different ways and bring out the synergies between disciplines instead of their competition. So that was a real breakthrough in a lot of cases.
There's also one last point. There's paradoxically, a number of these schools do not award traditional forms of tenure. And you might say, oh, that's part of actually reducing shared governance. But what we saw in a lot of places is because they were focused on teaching and because they had clear metrics for success as a teacher, and because basically once you got your first contract renewed, you were renewable from there on. On the one hand, you had an ability for, I suppose you'd call it more hierarchical and aggressive and agile decision-making. On the other hand, you had faculty who were all deeply invested and engaged in the process and less in defending the territory. And so it made them more agile, and it made for more of a culture of continuous improvement, rather than now we've done this and we won't let you make a change for another 10 years. Wendy, I think Megan, we're probably at time.
Yep, that was fantastic. So hopefully many of you are leaving inspired and not frustrated that you can't tear things down and start from scratch, which sometimes is so much easier. But I think a lot of the learning points, we will do a summary of some of the key takeaways and share this out with the group as well as the larger audience. So can't thank Noah and Bryan, as well as Joe, Azib, Don, and Chris, Megan, Sam, and I'm just very grateful to all of your contributions and for all of you that joined us today and taking out 60 minutes of a very busy week. So appreciate everyone. And you will be hearing from us soon.